The young boy's hands trembled as he clutched his father's coat, watching through the church window as flames danced across the night sky. Another black church was burning in Atlanta, 1935, and 9-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. felt something shift deep within his soul. The crackling fire wasn't just consuming wood and stone. It was forging the steel that would one day shake the foundations of American society. Inside Ebenezer Baptist Church, where his grandfather had preached and his father now commanded the pulpit, young Martin witnessed his first lesson in courage under fire. Daddy King stood before the congregation, his voice booming over the sound of distant sirens, declaring that no flame could burn the spirit of God's people. The boy watched, mesmerized, as grown men wept and women raised their hands toward heaven, finding strength in the very sanctuary that could be next. That night, as ash fell like gray snow on Auburn Avenue, Martin asked his father a question that would haunt him for years. "Daddy, why do they hate us so much?" The answer came not in words, but in the sight of his father's tears. The first time he'd ever seen Daddy King cry. Those tears carried the weight of generations, the accumulated sorrow of a people who had been told they were less than human. The church pews around them held the stories of freed slaves and their children, of families torn apart and dreams deferred. Each wooden bench had absorbed decades of prayers, sweat, and silent screams for justice. This was more than a building. It was a fortress where the black community had learned to transform pain into power, suffering into song. As young Martin walked home that night, the smell of smoke still clinging to his clothes, he couldn't know that this moment was planting the seeds of a revolution. The boy who trembled in his father's shadow would one day cast a shadow of his own, one that would stretch across a nation and change the course of history forever. In the heart of Atlanta's Sweet Auburn district, where the cobblestones still echoed with the footsteps of former slaves, a movement was being born in the pews of black churches. This is not just the story of Martin Luther King Jr., but the story of how the black church became the cradle of the civil rights movement, a place where whispered prayers would become thunderous demands for justice. The year was 1935, and America was a nation divided not just by the Great Depression, but by the brutal reality of Jim Crow laws that kept black Americans as second-class citizens in the land of the free. Yet within the walls of churches like Ebenezer Baptist, something powerful was stirring. Pastors weren't just preaching about salvation in the next world. They were teaching their congregations to fight for dignity in this one. Young Martin Luther King Jr. was watching it all unfold, absorbing every sermon, every song, every moment of collective defiance disguised as worship. His journey from a preacher's son to the voice of a generation began not with grand speeches or marches, but with the quiet observation of how faith could become the most powerful weapon against oppression. This is the untold story of those formative years, when a boy learned that the pulpit could be a platform for revolution. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and tell me in the comments what country and city you're watching from. The mahogany pulpit of Ebenezer Baptist Church stood like a fortress against the storm of hatred brewing outside its doors. Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., known to everyone as Daddy King, gripped its edges with hands that had known cotton fields and construction sites before they learned to hold a Bible. His voice, deep and resonant, filled every corner of the sanctuary as he preached to a congregation that needed hope more than they needed their next meal. Young Martin sat in the front pew, his legs barely reaching the floor. His eyes never left his father's face. At 9 years old, he was already beginning to understand that Sunday morning wasn't just about praising God, it was about preparing for war. The war against a system that told them they were worthless, that their children couldn't dream, that their lives didn't matter. The congregation before Daddy King was a tapestry of struggle. Mrs. Williams, the seamstress, bore calluses on her fingers from working 16-hour days to afford her daughter's school books. Mr. Johnson, the porter, carried scars on his back from a beating he'd received for looking a white man in the eye. These weren't just parishioners. They were soldiers, gathering strength for another week of survival. God didn't make any mistakes when He made you. Daddy King's voice thundered through the church. The window seemed to vibrate with his conviction. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. The response was immediate and electric. Hands shot up toward the ceiling, voices rose in agreement, and something that had been sleeping in these people's hearts began to stir. Martin watched his father transform before his eyes. This wasn't the man who quietly endured insults at the grocery store or bit his tongue when white customers were served first at the bank. This was a prophet, a warrior, a man possessed by a vision of justice that seemed to flow directly from heaven into his very bones. The church itself seemed to lean in, listening. Built in 1922 with money scraped together penny by penny, Ebenezer wasn't just a building, it was a declaration. While the outside world told black families they couldn't own property, he couldn't build businesses, couldn't educate their children, this sanctuary stood as proof that they could create something beautiful and lasting. The stained glass windows, crafted by black artisans whose names history would forget, cast rainbows across the congregation. Each color seemed to represent a different aspect of their struggle. Red for the blood spilled, blue for the tears shed, yellow for the hope that refused to die. Martin traced these patterns with his eyes, memorizing them without knowing why. During the prayer time, something extraordinary happened. Mrs. Davis, an elderly woman who cleaned white folks' houses 6 days a week, stood up and began to speak. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of decades. "Lord," she said, "we ask not just for strength to endure, but for courage to change what ain't right." The words hung in the air like incense, sacred and dangerous. Martin felt something shift inside his chest. His father had always preached about patience, about waiting for God's timing. But Mrs. Davis was talking about action, about changing things now. The boy looked around and saw nods of agreement, eyes bright with something that looked almost like rebellion. The church was evolving before his very eyes, transforming from a place of quiet suffering to a launching pad for revolution. As the service ended and the congregation began to file out, Martin noticed something he'd never seen before. People weren't just leaving church, they were leaving changed. There was a different set to their shoulders, a new light in their eyes. Daddy King had done more than preach a sermon. He had awakened something that had been sleeping in their souls. And young Martin Luther King Jr. had been watching every moment, absorbing every lesson, preparing for a destiny he couldn't yet imagine. The smell of chalk dust and determination filled the classroom at David T. Howard Colored School, where 11-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. was learning that education was both a privilege and a weapon. Miss Bradley, their teacher, stood before a class of 30 students crammed into a room built for 15. Her voice steady, despite the leaking roof that dripped onto their worn textbooks during every rainstorm. "Children," she said, her eyes scanning the eager faces before her, "you must understand something that the world outside these walls doesn't want you to know." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into their young minds. "You are just as intelligent, just as capable, just as worthy as any child in any school in this city. The only difference is the color of your skin, and that difference is not a weakness. It's a strength." Martin's hand shot up immediately. His classmates had grown accustomed to his endless questions, his insatiable hunger for understanding. "Miss Bradley," he asked, his voice clear and confident, "if we're just as good as white children, why do we have to go to separate schools?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and even at 11, Martin could feel the danger in it. Miss Bradley's smile was sad but proud. She walked to the window and pointed toward the gleaming white school building visible in the distance, where white children learned in classrooms with new books, proper heating, and teachers who weren't forced to buy supplies with their own meager salaries. That, Martin, is the question your generation will have to answer, and I believe you will. After school, Martin walked home through the Auburn Avenue district, his mind churning with questions that seemed to multiply with every step. The same street that housed his father's church was also home to black-owned businesses that defied every stereotype white America had created. Royal Pharmacy stood proudly on the corner, owned by Dr. Hamilton, who had somehow managed to attend medical school despite every obstacle placed in his path. The barbershop next door buzzed with conversation that was part gossip, part political strategy session. Martin often paused outside, listening to men debate everything from Roosevelt's New Deal policies to the growing tensions in Europe. These weren't the ignorant Negroes that white newspapers described. These were scholars, entrepreneurs, and thinkers whose only crime was being born with dark skin in a country that equated color with worth. At home, the King household was a laboratory of learning. Daddy King believed that education was the key to liberation, and he filled their house with books, newspapers, and magazines that most black families couldn't afford. The dining room table served as both eating surface and debate platform, where Martin and his siblings were encouraged to question everything, even their father's views. Martin, his mother, Alberta, said one evening as she helped him with his homework, "Your mind is a gift from God, but gifts are meant to be shared." She traced his small hand with her finger, and he could feel the calluses from her years of playing piano at church. "Someday, you'll use that mind to help our people. I can see it in your eyes." The evenings often brought visitors, other ministers, teachers, and community leaders who gathered in the King living room to discuss strategy and share information. Martin would sit in the corner, supposedly doing homework, but actually absorbing every word. He learned about the NAACP's legal challenges, about economic boycotts in other cities, about small victories and crushing defeats in the ongoing struggle for equality. One night, Dr. Benjamin Mays, the president of Morehouse College, came for dinner. Martin watched in fascination as this intellectual giant engaged his father in theological debates that lasted well past midnight. Dr. Mays spoke of a Christianity that demanded social action, of a gospel that called believers to fight injustice wherever they found it. This wasn't the passive, wait-for-heaven version of faith that many black churches preached. This was revolutionary theology. "Young man," Dr. Mays said, suddenly addressing Martin directly, "what do you think God expects from us in this life?" The question caught Martin off guard, but he straightened his shoulders and met the great man's gaze. "I think," he said slowly, "that God wants us to make things right down here, not just wait for things to be right up there." Dr. Mays smiled and nodded, and Martin felt something like destiny settling on his shoulders. As the visitors left that night, Martin lay in bed thinking about the conversation. Outside his window, Auburn Avenue was quiet, but he knew that across the country, other young black men and women were lying awake with similar thoughts, similar questions, similar dreams. They were a generation raised on the promise that education could change everything, and Martin was beginning to understand that with that promise came an enormous responsibility. The boy who had once trembled in his father's shadow was learning to cast his own light, and the world would never be the same. The summer of 1944 brought more than just Georgia's suffocating heat. It brought Martin Luther King Jr.'s first real taste of the venom that would fuel his life's mission. At 15, he was already enrolled in Morehouse College, his intellectual gifts having propelled him past high school into the rarefied air of higher education. But intelligence, he was about to learn, offered no protection against the brutal reality of Southern racism. The Greyhound bus wheezed to a stop in a small town whose name Martin would never forget, though he would rarely speak it aloud in years to come. He and his debate team partner were returning from a competition in Dublin, Georgia, where they had argued passionately about the rights of man and the principles of democracy. They had won, of course. Martin's oratory skills were already legendary among his professors and peers. "You boys get up," the bus driver's voice cut through the humid air like a rusty blade. His eyes were cold and matter-of-fact, as if he were commenting on the weather rather than demanding that two accomplished young scholars surrender their seats to white passengers who had just boarded. "You know the law. Coloreds to the back." The words hit Martin like physical blows, each syllable a reminder that in the eyes of the law, his intelligence meant nothing. Martin's companion started to rise, but Martin remained seated. His hands gripped the worn fabric of the bus seat as his mind raced through the legal precedents he'd studied, the constitutional amendments he'd memorized, the very principles of justice he'd just spent 2 days defending in debate. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest, "we paid for these seats. We have the right—" "Boy," the driver interrupted, his hand moving to the billy club at his side. "Oh, you got 3 seconds to move before I make you move." The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Martin could feel the eyes of every passenger boring into him. Some looked sympathetic, others amused, but all of them knew how this would end. The law was clear, even when it was wrong. The longest walk of Martin's young life was those 15 feet to the back of the bus. Each step felt like a betrayal of everything he'd been taught about dignity, about equality, about the worth of human beings. His debate partner whispered apologies, but Martin couldn't speak. The words he'd used so eloquently just hours before seemed to have deserted him when he needed them most. For the next 90 miles, Martin stood in the back of that bus, his body swaying with each bump in the road. His mind consumed with a rage so pure and intense it frightened him. This wasn't the righteous anger his father preached about from the pulpit. This was something darker, more dangerous. It was the kind of anger that could consume a man if he let it, or forge him into something unbreakable if he learned to channel it. The other passengers gradually forgot about the 2 black college students in the back, returning to their conversations about crops and weather and the war overseas. But Martin forgot nothing. He memorized the face of every person who had watched his humiliation without protest. He catalogued the silence that had followed the driver's commands, the casual cruelty of a system that could transform accomplished young men into boys with a single word. When they finally reached Atlanta, Martin's legs were cramped and his feet swollen, but his resolve was harder than steel. He walked through the familiar streets of Auburn Avenue, seeing everything with new eyes. The same businesses that had once filled him with pride now seemed like islands of dignity in an ocean of degradation. The same church where his father preached now felt like a fortress under siege. That night, Martin sat in his room and wrote furiously in his journal, trying to capture the complex emotions that threatened to tear him apart. "I had never been so deeply angry in my life," he wrote, his pen pressing so hard into the paper that it nearly tore through. "That bus ride to Atlanta was the longest of my life. I felt as though I had been kicked in the stomach." But even in his anger, seeds of something greater were taking root. The experience on that bus became a turning point that would echo through history. Years later, Martin would say that standing in the back of that Greyhound bus taught him more about the nature of oppression than any textbook ever could. It showed him that dignity wasn't something that could be legislated or granted. It was something that had to be claimed, fought for, and defended at every turn. As he finally fell asleep that night, one thought burned brighter than all his anger and humiliation: this will not stand. Someday, somehow, he would make sure that no other young person would have to endure what he had experienced. The bus ride that was meant to put him in his place had instead shown him his purpose, and Martin Luther King Jr. would never be the same. The library at Morehouse College became Martin's sanctuary during his junior year, a place where the 18-year-old could wrestle with questions that seemed to grow more complex with every book he opened. Surrounded by volumes of philosophy, theology, and social theory, he was searching for something that felt just beyond his grasp, a framework that could contain both his burning desire for justice and his deep Christian faith. Dr. Benjamin Mays had assigned his students to write a paper on the concept of love in Christian theology. But Martin found himself unable to write about love without addressing its apparent opposite, the hatred he witnessed every day in the Jim Crow South. How could he reconcile the Jesus who preached, "Turn the other cheek," with the urgent need to fight back against systematic oppression? The question consumed him. Late one evening, as the library prepared to close, Martin discovered a book that would change everything: Mahatma Gandhi's account of the Indian independence movement. He read through the night, his eyes growing wider with each page, as he encountered ideas that seemed to bridge the gap between his Christian beliefs and his revolutionary instincts. Here was a man who had defeated an empire without firing a single shot, who had transformed love into a weapon more powerful than any army. Satyagraha, Martin whispered to himself, practicing the unfamiliar Sanskrit word that Gandhi used to describe his method of non-violent resistance. The concept was revolutionary, not passive acceptance of injustice, but active, aggressive love that could transform enemies into allies and hatred into understanding. It was Christianity in action, the Sermon on the Mount, applied to social change. The next morning, Martin burst into Dr. May's office with an enthusiasm that surprised even his mentor. "Dr. Mays," he said, barely containing his excitement, "I think I've found it. The answer to how we can fight without becoming the thing we're fighting against." He spread Gandhi's book on the desk and began explaining the principles of non-violent resistance with the fervor of a convert. Dr. Mays listened carefully, his wise eyes studying his young protege with growing interest. When Martin finished his impromptu lecture, the older man leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Martin," he said quietly, "I believe you've just discovered your life's work. But understanding Gandhi's methods intellectually is one thing. Having the courage to apply them in the American South is quite another." That weekend, Martin returned home to Auburn Avenue with his mind churning with possibilities. During Sunday dinner, he shared his discoveries with his family, explaining Gandhi's methods with the passion of a young man who had found his calling. Daddy King listened skeptically. He had lived too long under the boot of oppression to believe that love alone could overcome centuries of hatred. "Son," Daddy King said carefully, "I admire your idealism. But when white men come with ropes and torches, turning the other cheek might just get you killed." The words hung heavy in the air, carrying the weight of too much experience with the reality of Southern violence. Yet Martin's mother, Alberta, reached across the table and squeezed her son's hand, her eyes bright with something that looked like hope. The following week, Martin had the opportunity to test his theories in a small but significant way. A white professor at a neighboring college had made derogatory comments about black students' intellectual capabilities in the local newspaper. Martin's classmates were outraged and called for protests, boycotts, even retaliation. Instead, Martin suggested a different approach. What if, he proposed during a heated student meeting, instead of responding with anger, we respond with excellence? What if we invite this professor to campus to engage in a public debate about education and racial equality? Let our intelligence speak for itself. The suggestion was met with skeptical murmurs, but Martin's reputation as a brilliant orator carried the day. The debate took place 3 weeks later in the Morehouse Auditorium, packed with students, faculty, and community members who had come to witness what many expected to be an intellectual massacre. Instead, they saw something remarkable. Martin engaged the white professor with such grace, intelligence, and dignity that by the end of the evening, the man was forced to publicly acknowledge his errors and apologize for his statements. More importantly, Martin had demonstrated something powerful to everyone present, that it was possible to fight injustice without becoming unjust, to defeat ignorance without resorting to hatred. The young man who walked off that stage was no longer just Daddy King's son or a promising college student. He was emerging as something entirely new, a warrior prophet who understood that the most powerful weapon against hatred was an unshakable commitment to love. As Martin lay in bed that night, he felt a clarity he had never experienced before. The boy who had trembled on that bus in rural Georgia had found his weapon. The student who had raged against the injustices of the world had found his method. The young man who had struggled to reconcile his faith with his desire for change had found his calling. Martin Luther King Jr. was becoming the leader the world desperately needed, even though the world didn't know it yet. Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania felt like stepping into another world when 19-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. arrived in September 1948. For the first time in his life, he found himself in classrooms where black and white students sat side by side, where his intelligence was measured not against the lowered expectations of Jim Crow, but against the highest standards of academic excellence. Yet even in this integrated environment, the weight of representing his race pressed heavily on his shoulders. Professor Kenneth Smith's social philosophy class became the crucible where Martin's emerging worldview was tested and refined. Smith, a white professor with radical ideas about Christianity's role in social change, challenged his students to see the gospel not as a personal salvation story, but as a blueprint for transforming society. "Gentlemen," he said during one memorable lecture, "if your faith doesn't make you uncomfortable with injustice, then you're not reading the Bible correctly." Martin threw himself into his studies with an intensity that both impressed and concerned his classmates. While other students relaxed in the evenings, he could be found in the library, devouring works by Reinhold Niebuhr, Walter Rauschenbusch, and other theologians who argued that Christianity demanded social action. He was building an intellectual foundation for the revolution that was growing in his heart. The other black students at Crozer watched Martin with a mixture of admiration and anxiety. He was clearly brilliant, but his intensity sometimes made them nervous. "King," his roommate said one evening, "you can't carry the weight of the entire race on your shoulders. You're going to burn yourself out before you even become a minister." But Martin knew something his friend didn't. He wasn't carrying this burden alone. Something greater was carrying him. One winter evening, as snow blanketed the Pennsylvania countryside, Martin experienced what he would later describe as a spiritual awakening. He was alone in the chapel, praying about his future, when he felt an overwhelming sense of divine calling. Not just to ministry in the traditional sense, but to something far more dangerous and far more necessary. He was being called to be a prophet, to speak truth to power, to challenge an entire nation to live up to its highest ideals. The realization was terrifying. Martin understood enough about history to know what happened to prophets. They were rejected, persecuted, and often killed by the very people they were trying to save. Yet even as fear gripped his heart, he felt a peace that surpassed understanding. He was not walking this path alone. The same God who had strengthened Moses to confront Pharaoh, who had given David courage to face Goliath, was preparing him for a battle that would define his generation. Dr. George Davis, the seminary president, became both mentor and father figure to Martin during these crucial years. A liberal white Baptist who had risked his reputation by advocating for racial integration in the church, Davis saw something special in the young man from Atlanta. During their weekly one-on-one meetings, he challenged Martin to think beyond the limited expectations that society had placed on black ministers. "Martin," Dr. Davis said during one particularly intense conversation, "God didn't give you that brilliant mind just to preach comfortable sermons to comfortable congregations. He gave it to you to disturb the comfortable and comfort the disturbed. The question is, are you willing to pay the price that kind of ministry demands?" The question haunted Martin's dreams and drove his prayers. His coursework in systematic theology forced Martin to grapple with fundamental questions about the nature of God, humanity, and justice. In his paper on the concept of sin, he wrote with passion about systemic racism as a form of collective sin that required collective repentance. His professors were impressed by his intellectual rigor, but some worried about the implications of his ideas. A black minister who spoke too boldly about racial justice in 1950s America was asking for trouble. Martin's preaching style was evolving as well. Gone were the emotional appeals and flowery rhetoric typical of black Baptist tradition. In their place emerged a sophisticated blend of intellectual argument and moral passion that could move both minds and hearts. When he preached at local churches during his seminary years, congregations sat spellbound as this young man articulated their deepest longings for justice in language that was both scholarly and stirring. The academic world beckoned to Martin as graduation approached. Several professors encouraged him to pursue a PhD and enter university teaching, where his brilliant mind could influence future generations of scholars and ministers. It was a safe path, a respectable path, a path that would keep him away from the dangerous front lines of the struggle for civil rights. But safety was not what God was calling him to. As he knelt in prayer during his final week at Crozer, Martin felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders once again. He could see the path ahead of him with startling clarity. Not the comfortable life of a scholar or traditional pastor, but the perilous journey of a prophet called to transform a nation. The boy who had stood in the back of that Georgia bus was ready to take his place at the front of history's greatest moral crusade. The seminary had prepared him intellectually. Now life would complete his education in ways no classroom ever could. Boston University in 1951 hummed with intellectual energy that matched the ambition burning in Martin Luther King Jr.'s chest. At 22, he was one of the few black students pursuing a PhD in systematic theology, navigating a world where his presence was barely tolerated rather than welcomed. Yet it was here, in the shadow of academia's ivory towers, that Martin would forge the philosophical foundations that would soon shake the world. Professor Edgar Brightman's personalist philosophy became the theoretical framework that Martin had been searching for since his undergraduate days. Personalism taught that personality was the key to understanding both God and humanity, that every individual possessed infinite worth and dignity because they were created in God's image. For a young black man living in a society that daily denied his personhood, this philosophy was revolutionary. "Mr. King," Professor Brightman said after one particularly brilliant classroom presentation, "but you have a gift for taking complex theological concepts and making them accessible to the average person. That's the mark of a great teacher and potentially a great leader." The words echoed in Martin's mind as he walked across the Boston Common, past monuments to American freedom that had been built by enslaved hands. The contrast between his academic success and his daily experiences of discrimination created a cognitive dissonance that fueled Martin's intellectual fire. He could debate the finest points of theology with the best minds in America, yet he still couldn't eat in many of Boston's restaurants or stay in its better hotels. This constant reminder of his second-class status became rocket fuel for his developing philosophy of resistance. In the Mugar Library, Martin spent countless hours crafting his doctoral dissertation on the concept of God in the theologies of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Weeman. But his real education was taking place in the margins of his official studies, as he devoured books on social philosophy, political theory, and the emerging independence movements in Africa and Asia. He was preparing for a calling that extended far beyond the walls of any church. It was during his Boston years that Martin met Coretta Scott, a talented music student at the New England Conservatory, whose intelligence and strength immediately captivated him. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of his growing certainty about his life's mission, and Coretta quickly understood that loving Martin meant joining a cause larger than their individual dreams. "Coretta," he said during one of their long walks through Boston's historic districts, "I can't promise you a life of comfort or safety. I feel called to something that's going to put us both in danger. If you can't accept that, I'll understand." Her response would echo through history. "Martin, I didn't fall in love with you for your safety. I fell in love with your purpose. Whatever God is calling you to do, we'll do it together." The Korean War raged during Martin's doctoral studies. And he watched with growing concern as America fought for democracy abroad while denying it to millions of its own citizens at home. The contradiction was stark and undeniable. How could a nation claim to be the leader of the free world when it systematically oppressed a significant portion of its own population based on skin color? Dr. L. Harold DeWolf, Martin's dissertation advisor, recognized that his student was wrestling with more than academic theology. During their supervision meetings, he often found Martin asking questions that had less to do with systematic theology and more to do with applied Christianity. How do we live out the gospel in a society that claims to be Christian but acts like pagans? Martin would ask. It was a question that would define his life's work, the intellectual isolation. Martin felt at Boston University was broken by his connections with other black students who were wrestling with similar questions about their role in American society. They formed informal discussion groups that met in dormitory rooms and coffee shops, debating everything from Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement to the emerging leadership of the NAACP. These conversations sharpened Martin's thinking and strengthened his resolve. As his doctoral work progressed, Martin began to see connections between the personalist philosophy he was studying and the non-violent resistance methods he had discovered in Gandhi's writings. If every person possessed infinite dignity and worth, then even one's enemies had to be treated with respect and love. Violence might destroy the body, but only love could transform the heart and mind. The completion of his dissertation in 1955 marked more than an academic achievement. It marked the end of his formal preparation for the role he was destined to play. Dr. King, he could now rightfully claim the title, had armed himself with the finest education America could offer, had studied under the most brilliant minds of his generation, and had forged a philosophy that could guide a movement. But even as he celebrated his doctoral achievement, Martin knew that his real education was about to begin. The classroom had taught him to think. Now the streets would teach him to lead. The boy who had once trembled in the back of a Georgia bus was ready to move to the front of the greatest moral crusade in American history. His calling was clear, his preparation complete, and his destiny waiting in a small Alabama city called Montgomery. The parsonage at 309 South Jackson Street in Montgomery, Alabama, was modest by any standard, but to 26-year-old Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it represented something monumental, his first opportunity to lead a congregation as their senior pastor. Dexter Avenue Baptist Church sat just blocks from the Alabama state capitol, where Jefferson Davis had once been sworn in as President of the Confederacy. The symbolism was not lost on the young minister who arrived in September 1954 with his new wife Coretta and a head full of revolutionary ideas. Dexter Avenue was unlike any church Martin had ever known. Its congregation consisted primarily of college professors, doctors, and other members of Montgomery's black middle class. Educated, articulate people who had grown comfortable with the status quo. They expected their new young pastor to deliver eloquent sermons and conduct respectable services, nothing more. They had no idea they had just hired the man who would turn their sanctuary into the headquarters of a revolution. Martin's first sermons at Dexter Avenue were carefully calibrated to challenge his congregation without alienating them entirely. He spoke of the beloved community that God intended for all humanity, of the Christian obligation to seek justice, of the need for the church to be relevant to the struggles of everyday life. The response was mixed. Some members were inspired by his vision, while others worried that their new pastor might be too political for their taste. The Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision in May 1954 had already begun to shake the foundations of Southern society when Martin arrived in Montgomery. From his pulpit, he carefully addressed the ruling, framing it not as a political victory, but as a moral imperative rooted in Christian principles. Segregation, he declared, is not just legally wrong, it's theologically heretical. It denies the fundamental Christian truth that all people are created in God's image. Outside the church, Montgomery's black community was growing restless. The NAACP had been quietly organizing, and there were whispers of potential challenges to the city's segregated bus system. Martin found himself drawn into these conversations, his reputation as an eloquent speaker and his fresh perspective making him increasingly valuable to the movement's local leadership. The bus system in Montgomery was a daily humiliation for the city's black residents, who made up 75% of its ridership. They were required to pay their fare at the front of the bus, then exit and re-enter through the back door if there was room. Often drivers would drive away before black passengers could reboard, keeping their money but denying them transportation. It was a system designed not just to segregate, but to degrade. Martin's own experiences with Montgomery's buses reinforced his growing conviction that the time for polite accommodation was ending. When a bus driver cursed at Coretta for taking too long to find exact change, when elderly black women were forced to give up their seats to white teenagers, when working people were treated like livestock, these daily indignities created a pressure that was building toward an explosion. On December 1st, 1955, that explosion came in the form of a quiet seamstress named Rosa Parks, who simply said no when ordered to give up her seat. Her arrest that evening sent shockwaves through Montgomery's black community, and by the next morning, leaders were gathering to plan a response. Martin found himself thrust into the center of discussions about organizing a bus boycott, a massive, coordinated act of resistance that would require the entire black community to walk rather than ride. The Montgomery Improvement Association was formed that very evening, and in a moment that would change the course of American history, Martin Luther King Jr. was elected its president. At 26 years old, with less than 2 years of pastoral experience, he was being asked to lead what would become the most significant civil rights campaign since Reconstruction. The weight of the moment was not lost on him.